Hi team, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the week off with spring break. Got a chance maybe to catch up a little bit, maybe to just have a smidgen of free time in your life. I found it to be a very productive week, got a lot of work done. Could use a spring break for my spring break, but we'll go with it. We have half a semester left in English 501, Writing Theory and Pedagogy, and we've hit a lot of the theory part. The second half of the semester, we still have some theory and some reading to go, but we also have our Ask the Expert presentations that'll be coming up in a few weeks, and likewise we have some other work projects. We will be looking at doing an effective writing sequence. This is all in your syllabus, and we also have a project next week that we'll do in the face-to-face classroom with the Digital Archive of Literacy Narratives, and so I've tried to get you involved with that as well, and I'll have some explanation as we work further. And then finally, there is a textbook selection and review that we will do towards the end of the semester. So all of those things we're not doing today, we're not doing this week. I just wanted to kind of give you that view from afar of what we still need to accomplish within the class. And so that accomplishment includes finishing up the theory, Ask the Expert, a textbook review, our effective writing sequence, and the DALN work. And we'll get to all of that step by step. For today, we are talking about three things in particular. If you can see them on the board, the first one says walk the walk, talk the talk, and I've heard from most of you. Eric has already given his walk the walk, talk the talk presentation by coming to the face-to-face class, and so that was on cognitivism, and he did a great job. Took on the persona of John Hayes, his wife took on the persona of Linda Flowers, and led us through a discussion and activities about cognitivism. I have on March 21st, Jessica Van Ness has signed up to do expressivism. It's a little bit out of order, but I told Jess I think that's going to work just fine. It's always good to go back and review some of these theories as we move on to other theories. So Jessica will have March 21st, and then on April 4th, Jenny and Shelley have said they will take over with, I think it's grading student papers or responding to student papers. So we'll have some theories about that and discussion about that the week before, and then Jenny and Shelley will be in charge that week of leading us. What does that mean to lead us? In the face-to-face classroom, generally the folks have a PowerPoint, they have information that they share with us, and then they lead us in an activity. In an online environment, I would assume that you can do something pretty similar, maybe a PowerPoint or a Prezi that has key quotes, figures, ideas, and so on. Perhaps you want to narrate that PowerPoint for us or give us a little more detail, because sometimes PowerPoints, I know mine especially, they're just meant to be guideposts, but since we're not in the same space, you may need to use your PowerPoint more deliberately. If there are links that you want us to click on and watch and so on, please let us know. Also, when you are the presenter for that week, you get to decide the activity for us to do. When we started off this course, I usually had 2 activities and 1 response for you to do each week. I realized that that was getting really difficult for some of you in terms of the workload, since so much of the response has to be written in this class. Therefore, after I did those phone conversations with everyone, I backed off and I made it 1 activity per week and 1 reflection per week. So we've been doing 1 discussion board activity and 1 reflection. What I'm getting at is, when it's your turn to do walk the walk, talk the talk, you decide the activity for the week, okay? So you'll decide the activity and I will assign the reflection. You'll just have to let me know what the activity is so I can post it up in the discussion board, and then we'll go from there, whatever it is that you're asking us to do. And that'll require a little bit more feedback from the presenters as well. I respond to your posts. I would assume then that the presenters would give some response to the post along with me when it comes to that activity that you're asking us to do. And I think that'll help us maybe create more of a conversation around these topics. Please let me know if you have any questions. And I know Kathy is still kind of hanging out there in terms of either leading a presentation or maybe being part of a group. So Jess, if you and Kathy want to work together, I encourage you to work to reach out to one another. If you prefer to work independently because you are in different places and have different schedules, I absolutely understand that as well. Okay? So moving on to our second piece for tonight, we're going to talk about collaboration. How odd to talk about collaboration rather than to do it. You are doing some collaboration as you work in the discussion board, or maybe as you work on these projects outside of our space here, our virtual space. So Jenny and Shelley, I know you're in the same school, so you've been able to collaborate or continue to collaborate. I know Eric collaborates with his wife Tricia on the work that they do for this class as well, in terms of discussing readings and maybe even doing assignments together. But when we talk about collaboration as a theory, we have a lot of information out there. I'm going to just lightly use the PowerPoint. Again, my PowerPoints for the class are meant more as signposts, so if you have a printed version of it, you'll notice that the title for this week is Two Heads Are Better Than One, and that's what collaboration is all about. And it's very much tied to the art of the social epistemics and the social constructivists. I have a slide there as well for Walk the Walk, Talk the Talk, because in our classroom on Monday, we had a Walk the Walk, Talk the Talk presentation on multimodal composition theory. And that is posted up in Blackboard under documents. So if you'd like to see what our in-class version did for Walk the Walk, Talk the Talk on multimodal composition, you are more than welcome to look through Rachel and Andrew's documents. They have a PowerPoint and they have a couple of extra readings on multimodal composition. They did a fabulous job in class, as with our other presenters that we've had in the past, and they brought us cupcakes, so that was a bonus. Moving on to the third slide and getting into the heart of collaboration, you'll see a slide that says, you say tomato, I say tomato. Social epistemics and social constructionists or social constructivists, they are the same. You're going to see different terms and different terminology because the field was being developed, or is being developed, it continues to be developed as writings take place. So when we look at these writings by Trimber, Bruffy, Howard, and Ingalls, they are talking about something, collaboration theory within social epistemic theory, as it is occurring. And so these words are a little negotiable. They are not set in concrete or stone yet in terms of what the movement was calling itself or being called by those who were theorizing it. So please keep that in mind if you are seeing these words used interchangeably. The next slide puts up a couple quotes from Trimber and Bruffy, and if we were in a face-to-face classroom together, we would definitely discuss, what's the gist of each of these articles, because there's some real density to the work that Trimber and Bruffy do, and I completely acknowledge that. So why don't we start with Bruffy? This one was written in 1984, and I'll put a few notes up on the board as well, maybe as signposts for us. So Bruffy, 1984. And if I asked you this question, what would Bruffy's classroom be like? I would hope that you would answer, it would be a space where there would be a lot of talking, there would be a lot of discussion. Bruffy is all about conversation, and he learned about collaboration by studying the medical field and also studying students' difficulties in transitioning into college. And the basic gist of it is that he thinks collaboration and discussion are crucial to thinking well and in turn to writing well. So you need to collaborate, you need to talk. So one of the things we want to consider is 1984, the year that Bruffy is writing this article. And I'm a child of education in the 1980s. I know what an English classroom was like as I went through middle school and high school in the 1980s. It was very formalist, at least my experience was. We diagrammed sentences, we did lots of grammar packets and worksheets. It was about structure, organization, and so on. We didn't talk about what we were writing about. We just wrote. You were given a prompt, you sat down and you wrote to it. That's formalist, that's current traditionalist. That was very much the style that was espoused by a lot of instructors in the 1980s. Again, I don't want to generalize too much. You might have had a different, you might have had a different experience if you too were a student in the 1980s, but by and large, the discussions I have with others make me tend to think that my experience wasn't that unusual. There was a lot of current traditionalist teaching going on. With that in mind, when Bruffy in 1984 is talking about the importance of conversation in the writing classroom, he's thought to be kind of out there. What is this about? You're going to talk? You're taking the teacher out of that authority role, and that's exactly what Bruffy's saying. He goes back to Vygotsky, so you might see some connections to what we saw in the Cognitivists. For instance, on page 397, reflective thought is public or social conversation internalized, and he sees thought and conversation working in much the same way, claiming that thought is created by social interaction. To understand internal thought, then, we must understand the nature of community life. Here's where that social epistemic, that outward thinking, we are impacted by society. It impacts our thoughts. Our thoughts impact the way we write. Therefore, society impacts the way we write. And he also argues to think well, we must be able to converse well. So there's that notion that students have to talk out what they're going to write about. They need to spend time brainstorming, not just on paper, but out loud. They need to discuss their writing with others, not for editing purposes necessarily, but for big picture, global purposes. Page 400, we must engage students in conversation during the writing process is what Bruffy is preaching. And he talks about a couple of different types of discourse. One is normal discourse, and the other is abnormal discourse. Oops, there we go. So, normal discourse and abnormal discourse. Normal discourse applies to the conversation within a community of knowledgeable peers. So, if you look at the slide that says discourse communities, it says to be conversant with the normal discourse in a field of study or endeavor is exactly what we mean by being knowledgeable. That is knowledge-able in that field. Mastery of a knowledge community's normal discourse is the basic qualification for acceptance into that community. So, to make sense of that, as you enter a discourse community, and we learned about discourse communities with Porter and Ryther and Blau and so on. So you enter that discourse community, you listen, you start to pick up the lingo of that discourse community, and you can join that normal discourse. You know the terminology, you know the words, you know how to play the game. So that's an important part of what Bruffy's talking about. So this applies to conversation with a community of knowledgeable peers. There are rules and conventions that govern the discourse community. You might remember those are described in Porter's work as forums. And then you practice and master normal discourse. And Bruffy argues, students need the opportunity to do this. We need to practice the normal discourse of the writing classroom. If we're not talking about it, how do we get better at it? So part of what's going on here is there's difference between peer review in the typical classroom where maybe you exchange papers, you never talk to one another, you just edit, look for commas and so on. Bruffy's like, no. Peer review has to be discourse. If you're going to do peer review, it should be students talking to each other about their papers, about what's going on in the papers. It can't be this silent exchange, one-to-one, of just getting out a pen and doing basically what the teacher has done in the past, which is look for editing mistakes. Along with normal discourse, if you go on a little bit further in the article to page 407, he talks about abnormal discourse, and he talks about how this is necessary to learning. You might have someone who is ignorant of a discourse community, or someone who puts aside rules of the discourse community and they insert abnormal discourse. So they bring something into the community that perhaps it doesn't fit, or it looks at the world in a way that's different from what the normal discourse in that community looks at the world. That abnormal discourse to Bruffy can be good in some ways. in many ways, because it makes the normal discourse kind of stop for a minute, consider why it is the normal discourse, why we do the things the way we do them, and then we can sometimes assimilate that abnormal discourse, or it can move the community further or forward by maybe inserting a new idea, a new perspective, and so on. Bruffy's really working on challenging knowledge through conversation and building intellectual communities. That might remind you a little bit of Sheridan Blau we read a couple of weeks ago. Remember, maybe way back towards the beginning of the semester, when we had across the board all the different categories of theories, and we had social epistemic all the way down at the end, and one of the things I told you is that the social epistemics are about creating knowledge, and that's one of the things we see here with Bruffy. He's arguing that when we let students talk to one another and converse, they're going to create their own knowledge. The teacher has to stand back and let that happen and maybe act as a guide or facilitator, but it's not the teacher giving the knowledge, saying this is the way how to write, follow this formula. It's instead letting students figure it out for themselves, try to come to ideas, even consensus on what's the best way to maybe speak to this audience, to argue this topic, what's most persuasive. Again, instead of the teacher telling the students the answer, the students come to the answers themselves and create knowledge themselves through conversation. So that's a quick look, maybe not so quick, sorry, when I look at the time up there on the wall, I'm like, wow, I talk a lot. That's a look at Bruffy. Let's take a look at Trimber. So Trimber is 1989. So we've got a few years, oops. Got a few years in between the two writers. My apologies there. And Trimber has some criticism of Bruffy, and rightfully so, wants to look at that. That's important. We might call that some abnormal discourse that's going on. They're in the same community, but it comes in with a little conflict. One of the things Trimber talks about is that advocates say the aim of collaborative learning is consensus through conversation. And he takes a bit of, he takes some aim at that. He wants to unpack that, spend some time looking at that. One of the points that he pulls out is that others say Bruffy has overlooked, or overvalued rather, social practices, and there's not enough focus on the individual consciousness in creating knowledge. But Trimber's not so concerned about that. It's not like we have to separate the individual and the collective. Why can't we have both? Why can't you have individual meaning making and collective meaning making, and they both can be robust, they both can be meaningful, and so on. For Trimber, he thinks we should use consensus to generate differences. That's really important. We need to have those differences because that's a piece of moving knowledge forward. And if you were to go on and take a class like contemporary writing theory, we would look at the works of Bakhtin, and Bakhtin talks about how important it is to always converse and have some dissonance, because it's in that dissonance and that tension that we always move knowledge forward. When we agree, the conversation can stop. It goes nowhere. No different than when a student, let's say, writes an analysis paper. They analyze an article and they agree with everything in it. Okay, so what? You know, you gotta have some tension for knowledge and thinking to move forward. And that's what Trimber's all about. So Trimber says we need to use consensus to generate differences, to identify systems of authority that organize differences, and to transform relations of power that determine who may speak and what counts as meaningful. So there's no need to polarize the individual and society. And we can see Trimber pulling in the work of Dewey. This is around page 442. Consensus does not necessarily violate the individual, but it can enable individuals to empower one another. So, you know, yes, there is some power in consensus. Knowledge is the result of conversation. That's something that Trimber definitely agrees with when it comes to Bruffy. It's the act of conversation. Knowledge is the result of conversation. It's not the act of an individual mind. And learning can't be understood solely on cognitive grounds. So the cognitive, that would be more of the individual, the inner thinking, the inner directed, and the social both have to come together. So when we had those discussions a couple of weeks ago where we had the inner directed versus the outer directed of cognitivism to social epistemic, you can see Trimmer saying, why does it have to be one or the other? Why do we have to be inner directed, Flower and Hayes? Why do we have to be just outer directed, Bazell? Why can't we both be both inner directed and outer directed in our thinking and in our theories? Trimmer finds Rorty's ideas of abnormal discourse problematic. This is around page 446. And he spends some time tying abnormal discourse to power. Think about that. You've got a group and they are collaborating and they come to consensus. Do they come to consensus because every single person in the group completely agrees, or do they come to consensus because there is maybe a more powerful personality in the group and maybe a quieter personality in the group? So it might be consensus because someone didn't speak up, or someone was afraid to speak up. Maybe there's a hierarchy of power within the group. When we think about our own students in a classroom, you put them in a small group and maybe they're the cool kids over here as part of the clique, and then there's other kids that aren't so cool. Depending on how much power these other kids feel, they might just keep their mouths shut. So the consensus happens because of that power differential. And so that's not true consensus according to Trimmer. And that's where he says Bruffy's model fails to see those problematic aspects. We need to ask students to explore the rhetoric of dissensus that pervades writing situations. So I'm going to put dissensus over here under Bruffy, but that notion that we can have that tension of disagreeing, and we need that dissensus that comes through abnormal discourse. Sometimes dissensus is much more powerful than consensus. We have someone who breaks away. We have a Martin Luther King Jr. We have someone who does something differently. We have a Rosa Parks, okay? So I'm going on a civil rights kind of angle right now. But that dissensus is sometimes really powerful for change, and Trimmer doesn't want us to forget that. If we want to put Trimmer into a gist, I would say social practices are important, but you can't overlook individual consciousness. Also, power dynamics play a role. It's not as easy as you think, Bruffy. That's Trimmer talking back to Bruffy. We're having a conversation with him. Which brings us to Howard and then Ingalls. I'll talk briefly about Howard first. And Howard's piece, Collaborative Pedagogy, talks about how Bruffy gives us that history of collaboration, dating it back to the 1970s, and probably maybe to some expressive theory back there, where we thought we needed to discuss to get out our inner truth and so on. Now, remember, as we move through these theories of collaboration, especially in the social epistemic realm, there is no truth. Knowledge is created, it's not transmitted from one to the other, okay? So no capital T truth necessarily, but those expressivists felt like you had your own inner truth. Hope that I didn't confuse anybody there. We got a lot of different truths going on. Formalists believe there's a capital T truth. Expressivists believe there's an inner truth. Social epistemics believe there's a lowercase truth created by society within a particular context at a particular time, okay? So going back to Howard, she talks a little bit about small group discussion and how it's the staple of composition pedagogy. And I'm going to just see if I've got my page number here real quick. I have this one in front of me. So page 54. She says, because composition studies include pedagogy as a central concern, collaboration holds a particular fascination for the discipline. As in other disciplines, small group discussion has become a staple of composition pedagogy. And so this is written after all this discussion by Bruffy and Trimber. We have composition pedagogy taking hold, and She says a little bit about connecting back to Porter on page 55, contesting that notion of a solitary author. Many go so far as to assert that all writing is collaborative, according to Howard. For scholars such as Thrales and Sullivan, collaborative pedagogy is not so much an alternative pedagogy as it is an accurate mirroring of the true nature of writing. So think about that. If you talk to your students about their writing, and I hope you do, is it individually their writing anymore, or does it take on impulses, ideas, perspectives that are led by you? Another example would be this. When you conference, if you conference with students, who writes on the student paper? Do you write on the student paper as you talk and then hand it back to them and they go back and make corrections, or does the student hold on to his or her paper as you two have a discussion, maybe takes some notes, and then goes back and works? Either way, the instructor is having some input. I use that example though because someone brought it to me years ago about the ownership of a paper. And when I hold the paper in a conference, and when I'm doing all the writing on a paper in the conference, whose paper is it then? Is it mine? Or is it the students? And so I've tried to become a lot more cognizant of that, making sure that the students are the readers of their paper, the reviewers of the paper, the writers on their paper. I certainly give them feedback. I know that's my job, but I also try to ask more questions than I give answers. Ask questions in this section. I wanted to know more here, or I was confused here, or what did you mean about this, or could you say this another way? What's another way you could say this? So prompting questions to be really cognizant of that collaboration that happens in the writing, knowing that I'm not going to be sitting across that student for the rest of his or her life every time he writes. I need to make sure that that student starts to grow in confidence and has their own skills coming from social networking, working with me, other students, and so on, but has their own internal skills that they can then take to their papers, to their work, and make decisions from a global level that maybe they weren't able to do before. So sorry for that aside, but I think it's important to think about the collaboration that goes on between a teacher and a student, and the fact how much of that paper then is the student's paper. Collaborative pedagogy provides a social context in which students can experience and practice the kinds of conversations valued by college teachers. And that sounds to me a lot like the intellectual communities described by Blau and Bartholomew. So, having those discussions. Howard's saying the same thing as Bruffy. She's basically saying, we let them have those discussions. We encourage those discussions. We provide spaces in which they can have those discussions in our classroom, and it helps them enter the discourse community. She also argues that knowledge is socially constructed. Some questions she asks: can collaboration lead to social change? So there's that potential there for action. And that's where the work of Howard maybe moves us in a different direction of Bruffy. How can we see writing, or how can we help our students see writing as having power and impact beyond the classroom? Students can be empowered by collaboration, not by lecture. I'll just have a quick aside, and my nephew is a freshman in college at a place I will not name, and he said, "How do you teach writing, Aunt Chris?" And I'm like, "Well, they write." And he said, "Thank you. How am I supposed to learn how to write when a person stands up and tells me how to write but doesn't let me do it?" And I'm like, I don't know. You do. You have to do it. You have to become part of the discourse community. You have to use the language. You have to learn to think like a person within that discourse community. That's what's going to help you achieve more as a writer, at least give you the tools to move more in that direction. Having somebody tell you about writing, having someone just mark the comma errors in your writing, teaches you nothing about writing, the type of writing that helps you think and grow and be part of an intellectual community that Bartholomew, Blau, and Howard are talking about. She also argues that collaboration mirrors the real world and talks about writing centers as sites of collaborative learning. So class discussion with the teacher as synthesizer rather than as lecturer, and students need to listen to one another. And sometimes the physical space of the classroom that makes that difficult to do if this student is talking to the back of that other student's head. But if we can try to find ways to move our classrooms around, have students in configurations where they can see and talk to one another, we can really promote that kind of thinking. Page 60, she talks a little bit about peer response and Elbow's believing game, and then having students point to parts of paper that elicit positive response. Also that notion of a write or read aloud, not a quiet peer response in isolation, so that students can take on readerly rather than teacherly roles in the collaborative process. Moving on a little bit further with Howard, 4 models of invention that she mentions. Platonic, that's the internal act that goes on when you're coming up with an idea for your writing. The internal dialogue is number 2, that mental conversation with your anticipated audience. Collaborative, where people work together to generate ideas or brainstorm in a small group. And then collective, that social collective with rules and conventions. She acknowledges the difficulty of writing together and talks about ideas and guidelines for approaching collaborative writing, and even problems of how to grade collaborative writing. I'm not necessarily advocating that students have to write together. I think sometimes it's good for them to try to write together. Again, that mirrors the real world. So many times documents are shared and are created across lines. I mean, I collaborate, and I'm sure you do too, with my peers all the time. So when students think about that, how might they have to collaborate in the future? And I see it in my own children's work, my sons who often have assignments where they have to work in Google Doc and collaborate with others. So there are really cool ways we can do that with technology today that are a lot easier than maybe one person writing on the page and then passing to the next person who writes on the page, and so on. So last but not least with Howard, on page 65, the importance of dissent and conflict in successful collaboration. Again, echoing what we heard from Trimber and from Bruffy. Last but not least, a little bit here about Rebecca Ingalls writing eyeball to eyeball, the term that she got from John Lennon, as she uses this opening from Yesterday with the Beatles, Lennon and McCartney writing together. She says your writing classroom can be a laboratory for collaborative work. It's important in the business world where there's common goals and combined efforts, so why not try that out in your classroom? Hers is a very practical piece, as I'm sure you saw, a lot different from the technical deep theory that we saw in Trimmer and Bruffy. She has advice on free writing and collaborative learning experiences on page 125. I'm sure you can read that on your own. And then on page 127, some advice for getting started. Keep an open mind when you are doing collaborative work or creating collaborative projects for your students, and ask them to keep an open mind as well. She discusses how should we form groups on page 128. I know this is a bone of contention. Many students come into college saying, we see data on millennial students that say they like to do group work, but that's not really true. They do like to work with others, but they're really concerned about group work in that I get stuck with someone who doesn't do his job. I have to do all the work. We all still get the same grade. And so those are the things that we have to think about if we're doing very formal collaboration. The other collaboration we talked about with Bruffy and Trimmer and Howard was pretty informal. You don't have to grade them having a discussion about their papers or brainstorming about topics. However, if they are going to collaborate towards a finished product, then things get a little dicier because a grade is attached. So some of the advice we get from Ingalls is to establish a group contract so everyone understands the project, knows how to communicate, knows how to meet deadlines, understands the level of ethics, quality, and so on, and everybody has a copy of that contract. That formalizes the process. So that's one way to go about it. She also has affinity diagrams for choosing projects, managing projects so that students' skills are maximized, and of course, as with Trimmer, Bruffy, and Howard, she talks about abnormal discourse and sees it as an opportunity for positive growth and change. You can write, then talk, and so on. I know that was a really quick look at Ingalls, but like I said, I don't need to read that to you. I think that's a piece that you should be able to get through pretty easily on your own. Where does that leave us? Discussion board and reflection number 8. Here's where I need you to kind of step away from your PowerPoint if you were looking at it. For instance, we do have some other points here: problematizing discourse, underlying principles of collaboration, and I think we've pretty much covered all of those. Where you want to skip your PowerPoint is here, where it says let's try it out. That was an in-class activity that we actually didn't get to. We substituted something else. So just cross it out, that let's try it out slide. I do want you to take a look at the next slide. It says collecting literacy narratives. In our face-to-face class on, what would that be, March 14th, we are going to be collecting literacy narratives. A literacy narrative is just what it sounds like. It's a story of how a person obtained his or her literacy, or a literacy memory. And this collection of literacy narratives under the Digital Archive of Literacy Narratives is managed by Dr. Cynthia Self at The Ohio State University. She is a wonderful person, a friend of mine, a colleague, very much honored and revered in the profession. And she started this archive because, one, she was interested in collecting people's stories, knowing more about what drove them to be readers and what drove them to be writers. You know, was it that children's book that somebody read to you over and over again? Was it that moment where a teacher marked everything with a red pen and then you decided, I can't be a writer, but then something turned you around and you decided, I can be a writer? She wanted to collect those moments, and she has been for years now, in an archive where anybody could watch them, listen to them, study them. It's a free open source archive that you can contribute to and that you can take from if you want to do research on literacy and literacy acquisition. So it's very helpful to graduate students who maybe don't have money to do big research projects. It's a huge pool of data for them right there, free and open online. So what we're going to do on campus is we're going to go to our student union on March 14th, and we'll set up a couple of different stations there, and the folks in the face-to-face class will go out and they will draw students in to share their literacy narratives. We will record them. We have paperwork we have to fill out for the Digital Archive of Literacy Narratives, and then those narratives will be uploaded to that big narrative bank at Ohio State. And it's a lot of fun. I wish you could be there with us. And you can, if you want to come on March 14th, just let me know. If you can't be here though, what I'd like you to do for reflection number 8 is to click on the link there to the DALN and watch some literacy narratives. Maybe even contribute your own. That would be super cool. You can spend some time listening to stories. One of my favorites, I won't be able to, Hazel Williams. Hazel Williams talks about her parents being sharecroppers, her parents being sharecroppers, and how education was so important to her own mother, and how her mother made sure that she and her brothers and sisters always had reading materials, always were reading and learning. And it's such a beautiful story about the history of literacy and passing down literacy as a gift across your family. So take some time, go into the DALN and watch some of those videos. By the way, if you get super jazzed about this, your students in your own classroom, in your own high school, they can contribute to this archive too, or maybe you can find a way to use this archive in your class. When I teach African American literature, I use Hazel Williams' video with Frederick Douglass. Douglass talks about, that importance of learning to read and how he would give anything to learn to read and then to write. And I share Hazel Williams' video done so many years later. African American community and that same treasuring of reading and writing that she saw in her family that we see in Frederick Douglass. So anyway, you could have your students contribute to the DALN. You could use the DALN in your classroom. There are lots of options and opportunities. So that's what I'd like you to think about for reflection number 8. The in-class group is not doing this reflection since they are doing the actual data collection. But for you, reflection number 8 is the DALN. Check it out. And think about its uses. How might it be used pedagogically? So that's what I'm asking you to do for reflection number 8. And of course, I'll put that up in Blackboard. Then backing up one to the discussion board, this is where I want you to think about collaboration and your own experiences with collaboration. There is a slide in the PowerPoint that talks about collaborative learning. It asks a bunch of questions about collaboration, so you might use that to spark your response. Of course, I'll also have a framework within discussion board where you have the opportunity to talk about collaboration and touch base with these articles, Trimmer, Brophy, Howard, Ingalls, how they impacted you and your thoughts about collaboration. Whoops. That means I'm supposed to be done, right? Okay, 2 things. Collaboration, you'll be writing about in the discussion board, and then reflection number 8, the DALN and its uses. Okay? Sound good? That's it for this week. I will check in with you again next week. If you need anything in between, feel free to call me or send me an email. All right? Take care.